I think the question of healing is a particularly complex one. My own understanding is rooted in deconstruction and archetypal psychology. Within those frames, whatever else healing involves, it is fundamentally about enabling the one who has been violated to find again, to befriend the self before violation. And this works also for collectivities, so families, communities, creating a space for reconnection. In this understanding, archive becomes critical to healing. To find that one I was before I was damaged means going back, means engaging with forms of archive, the unconscious, for example, the memories of the ones who knew me at that time, engaging with sites, spaces, a journal, other artifacts. There is no blueprint, though. Each one finds healing in their own way and in their own time. Having said that, there's no guarantee of success. Some just do not find healing. And the most that can be done is the creating of spaces and circumstances, conditions within which people can find healing. Creating those kinds of spaces requires archive. Archive again becomes of critical importance. For example, in many contexts, many cultures, there can be no healing for a family until the remains of a loved one who has died are found and that person is laid to rest. So here in South Africa, we still have a unit, an investigation unit set up after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, searching, using archive to find remains and then returning those remains to families. And of course, the remains themselves are a form of archive. I don't think one can talk about healing without talking about archive.
Hi, my name is Sexton and I'm a lecturer on the Archives and Records Management programme at UCL, and I just want to spend a brief amount of time talking to you about how we're embedding trauma-informed approaches to archives into the way that we teach our master's programme. First thing I want to say is that for us, teaching around trauma-informed theory and practice is part of a much bigger conversation. We introduce our students to concepts, contexts, related frameworks and related theories in this area, because we can't begin to talk to our students about trauma until we help them to understand what systemic oppression looks like in our context, what is symbolic annihilation, the fact that archives aren't neutral, the impact of the Western professional canon on archival theory and practice and how that's led to oppressions within the record-keeping profession. And we also want to give them access to kind of theories that help them make sense of this and the world and how it works, like critical race theory. And we also want to introduce them to the various ways in which we already have discourse that touches on aspects of trauma-informed approaches and practice. So concepts like radical empathy and ethics of care, survivor-centered approaches, what liberatory memory work is, and how that's been adopted in the field. So teaching around trauma-informed approaches is part of a much bigger landscape for us. It's really great that emerging scholarship in the last couple of years has given us a language and a framework and a means of talking specifically about trauma. So we can, on the back of that, be much clearer with our students about who trauma affects in our contexts, where it happens, and kind of subtle things like the differences between first-hand and secondary trauma. We also, thanks to great scholarship from people like Nicola, Laurent and Kirsten Wright and Michaela Hart, we have means of kind of translating trauma-informed approaches from other fields into our context. So we draw on that work and we talk to our students about the 5 principles of trauma-informed approaches. But for us, kind of embedding trauma-informed approaches in the way that we do things with our students is about helping them to take that and then use that to dismantle and reimagine and have radical conversations about how our archival principles need to shift, how our processes need to shift, how our services need to shift. So we try to provide moments on the programme where the students are talking about, you know, what does a reading room look like, which is trauma informed and truly safe and truly inclusive and truly empowering, as much as we can. So finally, very briefly, teaching challenges. Well, for me, one challenge is around kind of soft skills that you need to be trauma informed, like empathy. How do I translate that from kind of theoretical talk about what empathy is into kind of practical application for our students? Feedback from our students on kind of how they felt this embedding work and is working for them is that they love having kind of these radical conversations in the classroom, but there is a disconnect for them in terms of kind of these reimaginings that we're having and these discussions that we're having, and for them what feels like the reality in the sector. And I think linked to that is a concern that they have about current levels of support mechanisms for them as they leave the course and transition into work in the sector, you know, feeling that, you know, organisations, the profession aren't quite there yet in terms of support mechanisms. The Australians have done great work in this area. They've led the way. They've got some professional training in place. In the UK, we have a little bit, but there's more work to do. So I see my role as an educator, not just about how this embeds and impacts on the programme I teach on, but what my role is in kind of supporting the sector in training and support mechanisms that we might need to be kind of truly moving in the right direction in this area. I could say loads more, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody, my name is Emily Larson and I'm a digital collections specialist at the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center at the University of British Columbia. And I'm joined today by my friend and colleague Noah Duranseaud, who is a digital collections specialist and researcher also at the center. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that we are gratefully coming to you from the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
For some context about our work, the Center provides access to records of residential schools and colonial legacies for survivors, their families, and other user communities. The Center collects and integrates survivor stories, records, information, and conversations about the residential school system into its collections from donors and partners. The content of what we work with is difficult. We often work with records of trauma, and in general work in an environment that deals with Canada's colonial legacies and the ongoing effects of colonization.
These legacies came to the fore on May 27th, when Tk'emlúps to Secwépemc Cookpee chief Roseanne Casimir confirmed an unthinkable loss that was spoken about but never documented. With the help of a ground-penetrating radar specialist, the stark truth of the preliminary findings came to light. The confirmation of the remains of 215 children who were students of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. This event has had profound impacts on us personally and professionally. One of the ways in which this has surfaced is in our reference services. So while people have questions about this specific situation, it has also surfaced emotional reactions and memories that span much farther. When working with difficult topics in the archives, it is important to be resourced beyond targeted responses and to develop holistic support systems for ourselves and the people we serve.
Another thing that came to light during this time was the lack of reference training in archival education. In my own experience, reference was mentioned in passing as something an archivist would have to do in the early stages of career, and trauma-informed care wasn't mentioned, which made this work particularly challenging at first, especially when helping people who were searching for information on their own records or the records of their family members. There's also difficulty in being able to support others and at the same time care for yourself. Even though we do work in a supportive workplace, it can still be difficult to advocate for yourself and have boundaries, especially with this kind of work. As new professionals, we face the issue that many of our peers face when graduating, precarious labor. There is mostly contract work and not many job opportunities. And then there's a huge stress of when you get a job, you have to keep it.
And building on that, once you're in an institution, as a new professional, it can be challenging to advocate for yourself when you still lack power and authority. We hope to see more supports and resources made available to all archivists so we can move forward in a good way. And before we go, we would like to express our gratitude to Kirsten and Nicola for including us in this conversation, and to those participating and watching. We hope to connect with many of you in the future.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Isaac Fellman, and I am the reference archivist at the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco, where I work with collections relating to the height of the AIDS pandemic. Before this, I worked at the California Historical Society on collections surrounding the People's Temple and the mass death at Jonestown. Before that, I was a hospital archivist working with mid-century public health ledgers about tuberculosis. And I bring up this resume not because I think it's unusual, but because I think it's very normal. In archives, we very often work with collections that relate to great historical traumas, and we often find working with those collections traumatizing. I also think that we tend to feel that we don't particularly deserve help in working with these collections and handling the emotions that they provoke, because after all, the pain is not ours and we are professionals, so we shouldn't be bothered. I would like to push back on that idea quite strenuously. And when I think about the ways that I would like the field to change, I think of two things. One of them is my own history as a suicide hotline volunteer. When I was volunteering on the hotline, we had a very robust culture of debriefing. We could just, at any time, no questions asked, talk to a supervisor who was a trained therapist about the experiences that we were having on the line and the emotions that were coming up. There was no expectation about how we would feel, and there was no expectation about how we would express those feelings. Hotlines bring up all kinds of emotions, from joy to anxiety to concern to anger. And we really valued that safe space to just express it and be able to move along with our day having processed some of it. And I want archives to have a culture like that. I want us to be able to debrief and to feel comfortable saying, this collection made me feel some kind of way, or it set off a trauma from my own past. But at the same time, I feel like that can't be all. There are so many limits to that kind of approach, starting with the fact that archivists are not therapists. We're not trained to do this, and sometimes we might not want to confide in our coworkers about our most personal feelings. That's why I also think that we need to organize as workers. We need to be able to collaborate together to inform management that we need mental health care working in archives, just as we need physical health care when we hurt ourselves through lifting or repetitive stress. That is something that our work should provide, either through adequate insurance or perhaps through simply paying us enough to pay out of pocket for therapy. I think, I'm about at time, but yes, let's work together, let's work with management, and let's come out in the open about the ways that working with these collections may make us feel.
Hello everyone, my name is Daisy Murray Smith and I graduated from my postgraduate degree in Archives and Records Management last year, and I'm here to talk to you about the lack of awareness I had around vicarious trauma during my postgraduate studies, how I came to find out about it, and what I am doing now to raise support and awareness in my workplace. So to begin with, during my MLIT, we were taught 4 core modules around archives and records management and the theory and practice of them both. And during this time, we had no reference that I can remember of vicarious trauma. We were taught the ethical considerations of archives and the effects that archives can have on human rights. However, this was very much focused on those accessing archives rather than the effects that archives can have on us as records managers and archivists. I also took an optional module in military archives, and despite the generally morose nature of these and the gruesome details that they can have, there was no reference to how this might affect us as researchers and those of us who have to box list and handle these records every day. This ended up having a very negative impact on me as I work for the police and I handle police records every day, and I ended up suffering with vicarious trauma. However, I had no idea that's what it was because I had no awareness around the symptoms or even that it was a thing that could happen. Luckily, my mentor actually recommended the work that Nicola and Michaela and Kirsten have been doing on vicarious trauma as I was doing my dissertation on police archives. By looking at their work and researching into it a bit more, I was able to self-diagnose and get support through my work, and I now know how to handle records and when it's affecting me and recognise the symptoms quicker. Because of this, it's meant that I've been able to create resources for my colleagues. It's meant that I've been able to raise awareness around it, and then we've been able to create webinars and create workshops to kind of better our well-being in the workplace and support one another better. So my real hope going forward is that we can raise more awareness and that we can be taught this sooner so that we don't have to suffer with it before we understand what vicarious trauma is, and that we can recognise what the symptoms are so we can support one another and go into archives and records management with all the tools that we need to be able to do the job, not just for those accessing the archives, but for those of us behind the desks handling them. Thank you.
My name is Michaela Hart. I'm a senior digital archivist working for the state government here in Melbourne, Australia. Before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. I was first exposed to vicarious trauma as a risk when working with records in 2013, when I was embedded within the team responsible for responding to the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Abuse. Full-time working on that commission without support took its toll and prompted the first conference paper that I gave on this topic with Nicola Laurent in 2017. 4 years from then, and a few more commissions of inquiry under my belt, a lot of miles, words and conferences have brought us here today. Supported by a good-sized body of work written by archival scholars and practitioners, vicarious trauma regularly appearing within conference programs globally, we now also have a home for our community of practice. I've been able to take those learnings back into my work, and I'd like to talk to you today about just a few of the things that we've been doing to embed vicarious trauma and trauma-informed archival practice within my workplace. The vicarious trauma training that was provided by my department was necessarily designed for the frontline staff. It was good, but it didn't provide us with the missing element that we realised we needed. For those of us working in archives, to have our experience validated, for it to be treated as an occupational health and safety risk, and for this to be able to influence structural change. Some of the things we do in our unit to support staff are things like we provide them with a one-page fact sheet in their induction pack. It explains that we take their wellbeing seriously and that vicarious trauma is a thing that they should be aware of. One step back from that is we've started raising the types of records people might be expected to work with in an interview. It allows people to deselect if they absolutely know working with these types of records is not for them. But we don't expect people to know that. We have other things in place, such as being able to rotate through different collections and swap out with other staff if they prefer not to work with certain records. We teach each other hacks, such as turning records upside down so that you can't read the text. This is particularly helpful for our scanning and digitisation teams. We put content warnings on new accession briefings, or FONs, depending on where you are. We encourage staff to let us know if they're struggling with particular records, and there's no judgment. Team leaders are encouraged to make vicarious trauma part of scheduled team meetings, and we recommend it come under OH&S, but it's not mandated. Our leadership team spend time in our weekly meeting discussing wellbeing needs, and I'm so glad to be within a team that takes this seriously. Outside of the department, we're seeing more and more awareness of the issues. However, with the practical steps, there's still a bit of a gap. To try and fill this, I'm finalising the guide for us, but hopefully I'll be able to share it very soon, and it'll be shared amongst the community of practice. So thanks so much for listening to my 3 minutes. I'm really looking forward to the discussion next. Thanks very much.
Hi, my name is Itza Carbajal, and I am a first-year PhD student at the University of Washington in Seattle. Today, I'm going to talk to you very briefly about my own decision to pursue a PhD in information science with a focus on archival studies. So a little bit about me. Prior to starting my PhD, I worked for a few years as a Latin American metadata librarian at the University of Texas, Austin, specifically focusing on post-custodial projects coming out of the Lilas Benson Special Collection at UT Austin. Through that project, I worked primarily with human rights records, as well as organizations and people working on human rights issues in Latin America. During this time, I focused mainly on developing good metadata practices, providing the tools and necessary knowledge for our creators or our guardians of the records in Latin America on how to best describe their records, how to utilize that metadata that was created through these post-custodial projects for other efforts around the defense as well as uplifting of human rights in Latin America. And through this work, I really understood how important it was to think about the larger picture or to even focus on questions around what am I doing and how is this going to impact the present as well as the future. And so through this project, I really realized also that my skills and sort of my natural talents were really more about looking at the big questions and really honing in on possible solutions and not necessarily practicing. And so I decided to pursue a PhD in order to really have a career where I could dedicate the time to think about these questions and to really not only come up with solutions, but to think about all the possible options that practitioners should have and all of the implications that those options would mean, not only for the present, but also what does it mean to deal with the past and how are our decisions in the present going to impact the future. So now I am focusing more on trauma and archival records with a focus on populations of children and adolescents. I think working in Latin America really gave me insights into the potential of empowering communities that have historically been vulnerable, but that doesn't mean that they should remain vulnerable or that they are not themselves powerful enough to pursue their own solutions. And so I am really interested in thinking through a very particular population, specifically children and adolescents, and what does it mean for them to think through their memories through archival records, and how does trauma play in their own development as well as their futures as adults and contributors to society. So all in all, the PhD right now is really just my own way of contributing back to the archival field through research, study, and potentially teaching. And so I'm very interested in having these conversations around how everyone is contributing to these larger discussions on memory and how trauma plays a role in that, or how we can better alleviate the trauma that has been experienced through the past or is being currently experienced in the present in order to build a better future. Thank you for listening, and I'm excited to join my other participants.
Hi, my name is Kirsten Thorpe and I'm pleased to contribute a short video to the panel on trauma-informed archives. In the short presentation, I'm going to talk to you about my doctoral research, introduce that to you, and also share some of the work that colleagues and I have been working on at the Jumbana Institute for Indigenous Education and Research to support education in this area. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Darkinjung people, and also acknowledge those families who identify as Garingai. I also pay my respects to elders past and present. So briefly, my doctoral research has been focused on the topic of Indigenous cultural safety and the archives. Within that, I've drawn on William's concept of cultural safety as a foundational concept to explore how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can feel unsafe when engaging broadly with libraries and archives in Australia. The primary question has been, how do libraries and archives negatively impact Indigenous people's well-being by failing to produce information and archiving systems that best meet their cultural and community needs? And notably, this has included recognition of Indigenous people's spiritual and emotional needs and the incorporation of values in archiving aligned with Indigenous people's ways of knowing, being and doing. William's concept of cultural safety is to describe it as an environment which is safe for people, where there is no assault, challenge or denial of their identity, of who they are and what they need. It's a place of shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge and experience, of learning together with dignity and truly listening. So the research has found a significant cultural safety gap. The research has evidenced how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and cultures are frequently silenced and subjugated in the archives. There's a failure to address many systemic issues, particularly where Indigenous and Western knowledge management systems collide. The cultural safety gap also extends to how people lacked agency to deal with records that perpetuate stereotypes, racism, and a denial of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignties. Also, the proximity to colonial archives and collections caused heavy trauma and harm. A great source of concern has been the lack of recognition around this harm and a failure of libraries and archives to acknowledge the link between these historical representations and contemporary struggles with racism. One of the areas that is clear in the research is the need for truth-telling and the need for education. The research highlighted the limited discussion to date on the professional skills that archive and information workers need to work sensitively and respectfully in support of truth-telling in Australian libraries and archives, and that there was a lack of both theoretical and practice-based understandings of the requirements for respecting Indigenous people's cultural safety. And that finally, although we have many protocols for libraries and archives, and these tools encourage dialogue on the complex exchanges in library and archive settings, they do not specifically address support for Indigenous people's health and well-being or questions of cultural safety. So aside from the doctoral studies, which I'm also presenting on at AERI, and hope to have the results of that work published in the coming year, my colleagues and I at Jumbana Research have been working on a couple of professional development modules that really start to give a basic introduction to needs in this area. So briefly on screen is a professional development module produced by the Australian Society of Archivists on Indigenous record keeping and archives. And more recently, a professional development module that has been produced in collaboration with the Find and Connect team to support archivists who work with stolen generation records. So I guess both of these start to edge towards questions of supporting people's cultural safety and respecting the needs around trauma-informed practice. However, as my research has shown, we have a long way to go. So thank you for listening.
Hello, I'm Gary Brannan. I'm Keeper of Archives and Special Collections here at the Baltic Institute for Archives at the University of York. However, I'm here today to talk to you about developing emotional support guidance for record keepers here in the UK with the Archives and Records Association. So the guidance we put together for Archives and Records Association is something that took some time to get together. We first, and I say we, that's myself, my colleague Lizzie Baker, came up with the idea of developing this in 2013 following an AERI Northern Region Conference, Filth, Ethics and Obscenity in the Archives. Conversations there came to the fact that something needed to be done. That led to a conference paper in 2015 and an article in the Archives and Records Association magazine, a large survey of the membership in 2016 and the development of the guides themselves from 2017 to 2019. Very quickly skipping through the results of that survey of membership, which had one of the largest responses in our history, found that 46% of record keeping professionals felt the need for professionally related emotional support. 55% had been emotionally affected by an issue in the last 12 months. The vast majority, as you can see here, towards 80%, were relying on family, friends and colleagues to support themselves after working with distressing content. Only 12% felt comfortable using anonymised support networks. Most common response was the support networks don't understand us. 70% thought the support should come via the Archives and Records Association. So we developed the following guides. You can see there's 3 of them available at the web address at the bottom. They are preparing to work with disturbing content, after working with disturbing content, so techniques you can use as an archivist before and after you work with stuff, and also I think, and quite crucially, guidance for managers for what strategies you can put in place to support staff who are about to work with emotionally distressing content. And what you'll find is there's the guides online and a suite of linked exercises that you can use to provide yourself with self-support techniques. The guides were developed in conjunction with a clinical psychotherapist, Martin Smith, who has a particular specialism in treating anxiety, trauma and post-traumatic stress. We did that in conjunction with Martin by getting our task and finish group together, who are made up of record keeping professionals with an interest in mental health support, and taking a collaborative approach with Martin so that he really understood the particular challenges we work with. We developed those extra resources as well and exercises, so it's not just it's text on a page, there's active ways to support yourself. And these were further supported by in-person workshops in 2019 that were held in London and Manchester, so Martin could take people through in more depth those support techniques. I hope that's been useful for you. It's a very quick run through what we did. The guides are available on the Archives and Records Association website, and I'd be happy in future to take any questions people might have. Until then, thank you very much.
We would like to start by acknowledging that we're coming to you from the stolen and unceded lands of the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. In this video, we will run through our motivations in discussing trauma in archives and our work in creating resources and initiatives around trauma-informed archival practice.
This can be difficult work, and some may think it is easier to avoid these discussions and the traumatic material altogether. However, this material is vital for justice, healing, and truth-telling. What trauma-informed archival practice will look like will vary across organisations and individuals, but this must be seen as an organisation and sector-wide issue. We believe it is essential to engage with issues of trauma so that the work of justice and healing can occur, and so that archives are safe and empowering spaces for all.
We want to raise awareness of trauma in archives and the impact that it can have on both archives users and staff. We are aware that many people are still coming to terms with the idea that archives are places of affect and trauma. The more we can have these conversations, the more these issues can be shared and understood. Then organisations and the profession can respond and take action accordingly. We want all who interact with archival organisations to be properly supported in working with and accessing archival materials. We believe that trauma-informed archival practice will assist in making trauma in archives both normalised and planned for, so that there are frameworks and mechanisms in place before people reach the stages of becoming traumatised.
We want to create practical tools and spaces that are useful for archivists working today. There is a separate strand of work to be done around archival education, but we are very aware of many archivists needing practical assistance, particularly those who might be working by themselves or in small teams. Finally, we are aware of the benefits of peer support and having colleagues, both in immediate workplaces and in the profession more broadly, to discuss these issues with. It is important to have spaces to share experiences and provide and receive support. We are interested in creating and maintaining these spaces where it is appropriate for us to do so that this type of support is available.
In terms of resources, there are 3 that we want to highlight here. First, we created an online course called A Trauma-Informed Approach to Managing Archives, which was developed for the Australian Society of Archivists. This is a practical resource to help archivists understand trauma-informed archival practice and vicarious trauma, and provides tools and actions they can use in their day-to-day work. We are now working to develop online and in-person workshops, which will run later this year, also through the ASA. Participants will complete plans for implementing trauma-informed practice in their organisations, and we will discuss opportunities for advocacy to enact this work.
And finally, we are the co-founders, alongside Michaela Hart, of the Trauma-Informed Archives Community of Practice, which includes meetings and an online space to enable information and resource sharing and peer support. We've had an excellent response to establishing the community of practice, so please do come and join us. We are so much stronger when we work together, and we look forward to working with you, having more of these conversations and taking action into the future.
I want to thank Nicola and Kirsten for inviting me to contribute to this webinar in such amazing company. And it's this sense of being in company, of not being alone, that I want to think about here. In 2019, for research on the relationship between record keeping and grief work, I interviewed 29 archivists about the emotional dimensions of their work. There were so many insights shared by these folks, but the one thing I want to highlight right now is the professional silence they identified around emotion, and especially around difficult emotions, trauma, and secondary trauma. I asked every participant whether they felt their education and training had prepared them for the emotional dimensions of record keeping, and every one of them said no. Many of them laughed at the question as if just the thought of that they might have talked about these things in archival education programs was preposterous. However, the majority also spoke of the urgent need to start doing so. It was such a common refrain, how the silence, the lack of acknowledgement of the emotional dimensions of archival work in education programs left people feeling unprepared for and even shocked about how much of their work involved emotion, involved working with people in different emotional states. For example, working with donors at the end of life or at the end of a beloved career, or working with researchers accessing records about themselves or their family members that were harmful or difficult in different ways. Mental health files, coroner's reports, records of the Indian residential schools, and so many other types of records too. Several participants told me that the interview was the first time they'd been able to talk about or share their own difficult experiences, their sense of being unprepared and silenced, the symptoms of secondary trauma they'd experienced, or feelings of sadness, anger, or shame their work brought up. I was often thanked by people participating in my research project for giving them a space to unburden themselves, to speak openly. This is not okay. It is not okay that we have not talked about these aspects of archival work as we prepare students to go out into the workforce. Thinking about the trauma-informed principle of empowerment, I want us to think about how the simple act of talking about these experiences can empower us in our work, in our interactions with others, and in our ability to care for our own well-being. Making space and providing opportunities to talk about the different ways that students may encounter emotion, especially difficult emotions and trauma, can increase awareness of this type of work so that students feel less shocked when they confront it. Talking about it can help students feel less alone when they go out into the field, knowing that they're not the only ones to have these experiences. And it can help to begin to build networks of support and understanding. Some of you may have noticed I just referred to the simple act of talking and might have thought, well, talking about emotions is not so simple for me. And I think this is true for lots of people and will be true in classrooms as we start to have more of these conversations. As Nicola and Kirsten point out in their article in Archivists, safety is the bedrock principle for trauma-informed practice because, quote, if someone is not safe, the other principles do not matter and cannot be enacted. How we make the classroom a safe space to discuss trauma-informed practice is a question that requires a lot of thought and attention, and there isn't enough time in this short segment to elaborate on how to create safe and brave spaces in the classroom. Though this is something that needs to go hand in hand with, as Nicola and Kirsten have written, normalizing discussions of and support for trauma, vicarious trauma, self-care, and mental health more broadly, so that records workers can feel safe bringing up issues and knowing they will be supported when doing so. This empowerment through talking and safety through support has to start in classrooms. It is not okay for us to ignore this silence any longer. Thank you.